believe it, is that they will be orchestrators of agents on their behalf. I think you will have, 10, 20, 50, 100 agents running on your behalf to doing various things and building various elements. You still have to be really sound in your ability to, ask the right questions, make sure the tests are really well thought through, but you're obviously not going to be in a terminal sort of making syntax changes.
Welcome back to Control-Alt-Lead, the podcast from computing where we talk to IT leaders at the sharp edge of strategy. Today, I'm joined by Stack Overflow CEO Prashanth Chandrasekar. So Prashanth, thank you so much for joining me from not so sunny Texas.
Indeed, Tom. Thank you for having me. Yes, we've had a relief with the weather for the past couple of days, so that's great. Welcomed here after a series of 100-degree days. So,
yeah, it's a real relief, and I find myself, ironically, for a Brit, begging for the return of rain here. Okay, Prashanth, we're talking today about obviously Stack Overflow, the developer sort of ecosystem, and artificial intelligence, and how it has affected developers. So, Stack Overflow has been quite affected by the launch of AI, or generative AI, I should say. When did you first realize that these new AI systems were changing how developers interact with knowledge?
Yeah, November 2022, to be specific, when ChatGPT came out, I think it was pretty obvious that this new form factor was going to be a completely disruptive new entry into sort of how people engage with knowledge more broadly. And I think the user interface that everybody obviously fell in love with after that, I think was pretty clear that if you sort of project it out over the sort of the arc of time, you could imagine this capability being really, really a kind of very powerful one, especially if you're a science fiction fan, et cetera. Like, you could sort of imagine what is possible. I think nobody obviously imagined that it would sort of get so good so fast. And I think has caught people off guard for sure, including people who are deep in it. So I would say that was the moment. I think we pretty quickly realized that the way in which humans would interact in a kind of frictionless way with access to this kind of very large repository of knowledge. And clearly, obviously, our knowledge is now even officially part of all the LM models as part of pre-training or data licensing agreements with all the big AI labs and cloud providers. We've sort of leaned into it right out of the gate. But we knew also, of course, our own user base, which is about 100 million people from around the world that came to our site for over 18 years. You started noticing, like, very quickly that many of them actually wanted to use ChatGPT to actually post answers on our own site. And I think our community, correctly, along with us, at that time at least, we decided that given the amount of hallucinations, et cetera, this is back in 22, obviously a very different story today, that it wasn't appropriate for us to do that back then and sort of pollute this knowledge base that has been very sort of carefully curated for over 15 years back then. So I would say it was pretty clear back, right from the get-go when ChatGPT came out, this is going to be fairly transformational and sort of game-changing for the ecosystem. And, we had to do something about it. I'm very happy to talk about all the things we've done since then, but that was the moment.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty impressive level of sort of foresight. Most people back when ChatGPT was released in November 22 were just using it to do very basic consumer level stuff. But you could see this, the impact this would have on Stack Overflow, which is great. So Stack Overflow is all about developers sharing knowledge. What is it like to run a company whose USP is threatened by this new tech?
Yeah, it's a fairly large hill to climb, just generally speaking, because it's like a fairly huge platform shift. Even a platform shift is sort of understating what this is about, right? I think Demis Hassabis, he talked about it earlier today, where he describes it much like I've done, which is like electricity, right? Like, that is not a platform shift. That is a fundamental introduction of something that changes how you think about what's possible, really. And so I think that that sort of level of change happens, not very often. So then the question becomes, if your companies are created and you're adding value in a particular, let's say, phase of history, with certain assumptions. Is like these are foundational assumptions. All of a sudden, those foundational assumptions have changed, and you've now sort of entered this new era. And so then companies like ours who thrived during that time, that initial set of assumptions, I think has to rewrite, basically refound the company in a very new way, which is very difficult work, right? Because you have served a very specific community a certain way for a very long time. And the natural inclination will be from everyone, by the way, the community members, from your own employees, from, investors, whoever, even yourselves, that, you sort of keep things status quo and not really change because, like, you don't want to rock the boat and so on. But the only way to survive and thrive is to, in fact, do exactly that, which is to completely rewrite the business in a way that makes sense for this new kind of plane of existence that you're trying to get onto, by the way. So, technology, the name of the game is change. I mean, like, if you're not changing yourself when the, technology landscape is rapidly evolving, like in this era that we're in, I think it's it's very dangerous for companies. So the answer is that it's difficult work, but it's extremely rewarding work because it pushes your ability both for your teams and yourself to think about what's possible, what do you have in terms of what is valuable to people and sort of users in this new world that you're entering into. How you can really sort of evolve the organization, how do you kind of go through that change, and especially from a leadership standpoint, I have found it to be one of the most rewarding, if not the most rewarding periods of my career because it's like, you push yourself, you have to really dig deep. This is definitely sort of a crucible moment. And you have to sort of figure out how do you motivate people in this moment where you're trying to say, okay, look, we have to create our own chapter. What is that chapter? Let's go actually start that and think basically like a founder. Even though I'm not officially a founder, I started in 2019. I've been here for about 7 years. But I had to sort of put on a founder mentality pretty much to sort of think about what the future of the company was about. So yeah, that's hopefully gives you a sense.
Mm. Uh, you talked there about the ways that Stack Overflow has had to change. Let's dig into that a little bit. What
Yeah.
fundamentally has changed for Stack Overflow with the introduction of generative AI more widely and for enterprise scale?
Yeah. And the biggest shift for us is that, we've historically been known as this amazing public platform where 100 million people came to the site and shared knowledge with each other on all things technology. When they were writing code, they had an issue, they posted it, somebody else answered it, and all that knowledge accrued in a very accurate, trustworthy way for over 15 years. And that continues to be the case. It's, the types of questions have changed. The volume has changed because simple questions don't get asked on our platform anymore. They're asked directly on ChatGPT. So that is the first chapter of the company. What we really leaned into, Tom, is the enterprise. And our big change was the pivot from focusing on this public corpus of knowledge that we were creating to really creating a knowledge intelligence layer inside companies. And this is what we call Stack Internal. And the reason we came to this conclusion is that in the era of AI, it's very clear that high quality knowledge or context, or as we like to say, gold standard knowledge, is very, very useful for a variety of reasons for AI agents to really operate well inside companies. And we realized also through our customers, in fact, who pulled us in this direction when they were using one of our enterprise products called back then Stack Overflow for Teams. They use the APIs very heavily to suggest that they really loved this trustworthy knowledge base. And they were really asking us for, hey, can you expand this where this trust can be expanded across all my knowledge bases? And so that I can really leverage sort of the golden nugget, so to speak, for my AI agents to use and not really, kind of work off of inaccurate information. So that was the biggest change that we've made, Tom, is this pivot towards the enterprise and with this product or platform really now, which is called Stack Internal, which we are launching several new things here in July, as well as in September in a couple of months, where it becomes the organizational memory layer. People have called it the organizational brain, where it's really ingesting knowledge from all parts of the company. It could be from Slack, it could be from Jira, it could be from GitHub, it could be from obviously our own community product, or any documents, Confluence, those sort of things. It chunks it up into these knowledge nodes. It wraps around a lot of metadata elements that are trust elements like authorship and recency and relevance and so on. And then based on the permissions of who really should get access to this information is surfaced wherever the user is. So meaning it's headless. and we're not forcing people to come to our platform, because I think the future of software and tech companies, especially for companies like ours, is to be headless, to be in ChatGPT or be in Cloud Code, but provide this trust layer and kind of green check mark that we've been known for as data gets surfaced and you can read and write to it at the same time. So that is the major change. One other thing I would say, Tom, is on the public platform, we've continued to evolve that also to be modern, in that we have included things like AI Assist, which grounds the answers in the knowledge base that we have, which is something like 80 million questions and answers. But also, we have obviously done all these data licensing agreements with these big AI labs and cloud providers. And finally, most recently, we launched something called Stack Overflow for agents, where it is basically the equivalent of Stack Overflow, but API first, where agents are sharing information with each other on our new platform. You can go to it at agents.stackoverflow.com. And that is to create effectively a knowledge base of what agents encounter as they're trying to solve problems. The net effect of all this is that you save on things like token costs very meaningfully, because you're reusing knowledge, whether that is on our public platform or inside the enterprise through our Stack internal product, so that your agents don't have to keep burning a bunch of tokens to do the same things that other people have already done, as an example.
Yeah. So obviously, burning tokens, huge issue at the moment. Agents also very much in the news. But a lot of that comes back down to data governance. Agents may have to perform multiple searches or get stuck in a loop because of poor data quality. And you
Indeed.
talked there about these golden nuggets of information. And you've talked before about AI systems having a trust gap. So how can enterprises start to tighten up their data? What is the biggest blind spot they have on data quality?
Yeah, I think that people sort of have assumed that if you can just connect to a bunch of sources, your problems are solved. I think that the kind of the early assumption has been, let me just have a bunch of connectors, and search is, enterprise search and so on is fairly commoditized these days. Everybody can access information inside your companies by just connecting to a bunch of sources. But the missing layer that people, I think, have underestimated is, how do you trust that the knowledge in those sources is actually accurate? I don't know any company sort of who can say that they have accurate, consistently updated, always greenfield, and not greenfield but always evergreen in nature. And that, I think, this knowledge problem has been around for a very long time, and nobody's really solved it. And we believe we are solving it with the new way in which we're doing it, with kind of our ability, as I described, with Stack Internal. Um, but that, I think, is the underestimated part. Like, how do you validate? How do you score? How do you make sure it's trustworthy to then leverage that knowledge in your AI workflows and use cases? That's well beyond just merely connecting to the original data sources, as most people, I think, start out doing. So yeah, they need to get that right, and that, I think, is a great unlock, not only for trust and for quality, and and really sort of being effective, but also, again, as I mentioned, being very efficient with regards to your token costs, and not just repeatedly doing a bunch of stuff off of inaccurate information all over the company. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, and then you have to deal with that. This compounding effect is disastrous for the cost and efficiency losses that you're likely to encounter, and leave alone your operating costs. So that's kind of, I think, the biggest issue within companies.
We've talked about agents a little bit now. And they are the new hotness. I think we've moved away from generative AI being the be all and end all, and now we're into agentic AI. But they are still perhaps not enterprise ready at a lot of companies. So, where, in your opinion, do enterprise agents fail the most today? And I'd also be really interested in hearing where you think that problem can be solved. What's the fastest way to harden them against this failure?
Yeah. I think some of this has been talked about quite recently, is that I think the notion of giving agents the ability to perform autonomous actions on your behalf, I think we're making a few assumptions. I think the main thing is that, is it working off accurate information? Number one. Number two, is it cordoned off in a way that makes sense and because enterprises are complex beings, right? Because if you're one of, you and I could be in a company, and it'd be maybe, it'd be fine for us to share all the information because only two people. But when you're in a company of, let's say, 10,000 people, you can't have agents just floating around doing whatever they want, pulling from whichever sources they want and doing whatever, or being initiated by a random user somewhere in the company. So there's a lot of permissioning issues. There are a lot of scoping issues to deal with. So basically, first point is context. Second point is, who should get access to this information, and how do you really sort of sort those sort of things out that should come down to things like privacy. And of course, there are security implications around this, because it's, the attack vector just sort of completely compounded in a big way. So I think those are I would say, bigger pillars. I would say there are all sorts of other issues, but I would say context, privacy, permissioning, and then there's security. I think those elements are where I think as enterprises look to roll out agents and agentic AI inside companies, it's easier said than done, because most companies are ossified in the way in which they operate, because there's a reason why they're an organization. They've operated with certain processes. They've gotten efficient doing those. But now with the agentic era, it is requiring them to rewrite pretty much all of that in a pretty large scale way. And that is not easy to do overnight, especially after you've relied on all that for, let's call it, over a decade, at least many years. So that, I think, is the place where agents don't work, because you can make it work in a small group, even in a large organization. That's why you see pilots, probably being very successful. You see some of the metrics coming across as quite good, and people are enthused about it and so on. But the issue comes around when you're trying to roll it out much more broadly, just generally across the organization. And, I'll mention one other point, which is the kind of the fourth point would be, the organizational change that companies have to go through to embrace something like agents as first-class citizens within your organization. That takes a pretty large leap of faith to say, you know what, I'm going to treat this as a digital employee to go do X, Y, Z. Clearly, the future is moving in that direction, and I think there's a lot of promise where we'll end up. But that level of trust, I think, is a multidimensional one, especially when people are worried about the rhetoric around them losing their roles and jobs. To digital employees, it's about, what happens if something goes wrong with that autonomous agent, and who's accountable, the person's accountable. So there's a trust element. You pointed that out. That's why, we focus very much on trust. That's a very, very important word as it relates to adopting agentic AI inside the enterprise.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of cultural change to go on there, a lot of change management as well. Um, a lot of our listeners are going to be wondering whether they and their organizations are ready to adopt AI at scale, and especially how to get ROI from that AI investment. So, is there a single diagnostic question or a test they can perform to find the answer to that question?
Yeah, I think for us, the way we've thought about it, we use AI quite heavily within our organization to, build prototypes of products, even final products that we are increasingly now relying heavily on things like Codex to do. It is what we are trying to measure is our rate with which we can deliver value to our customers and users increasing. And so for us, it's about how fast can we deliver value to our customers based on input that we receive. What is the cycle? What's the throughput? That, I think, is the biggest single metric, which is important to us as it relates to speed of innovation. As I mentioned previously, we're trying to reinnovate or reinvent ourselves in many ways. And so for us to be able to do that rapidly is very important. So for us, that's one of the biggest metrics for me, is like, how many releases are we actually able to push into production on behalf of our customers' requests. And if we're able to respond to their requests very fast based on what we can produce with AI, like, that's a big win for us, because we're previously constrained by capacity and processes. But now, if we can supercharge that, that would be amazing. So that's the single metric that I look at personally, Tom, as it relates to speed of innovation. Of course, there are other metrics that people also, companies that we talk to are very curious about. Is it driving efficiency more generally? Is cost savings? Is it effective as it relates to the operating costs? Because when you're investing in AI, which is not inexpensive, as prices go up, I mean, it's an odd time, because prices I expect to go down over time, generally speaking, because that's going to have competition will force that. I come from the cloud world, and we saw that with the cloud pricing wars back in the day. I think the exact same thing's going to happen here. But the overall cost that you're investing as a big enterprise, I think, will be quite large, and it will probably be in advance of you seeing productivity gains. And so you're probably going to see this big cost line item in your P&L even before you see the impact of it. And I think the push in the system, especially for CFOs and CEOs, will be, hey, what am I actually getting out of this investment? As I invested $10 million on some AI software this past year, when am I going to see the return as it relates to productivity savings? Am I working with smaller teams and producing the same amount or producing more in the future? Like, those are the sort of things that I think productivity and efficiency gains is what I think other companies will also look at, in addition to, of course, the innovation metric that I mentioned. So it's on both sides, so revenue and expenses.
So something for the CIO and the CFO to consider.
Indeed. Yes.
Okay. Prashanth, if I can just ask you to be slightly forward-looking here
Yeah.
for our final question as we draw to a close here. Perhaps looking 5 years out is a bit ambitious with the speed of evolution that AI is going on. But let's say 2 years out, how do you see developer workflows evolving in the next 24 months, and what skills are going to matter the most?
Yeah, I think it's honestly, it's quite it's tricky to do predictions, only because I tried it earlier in the cycle, and I was like kind of dumbfounded how fast things sort of moved, and it's been quite shocking to see the rate of progress. And I think this is the great thing about competition. When you've got 3, 4, 5 large players and they're pushing each other pretty quickly, and so having said all that, I do believe in the next couple of years, I mean, software development especially has completely changed. I mean, the notion of having to think about, let's call them the primitives, is no longer needed, right? So, like, you just don't need to sort of do it the way that you did it before. And so now, with the ability to really produce, let's call it high quality software, just for a second, as it continues to improve, with very rapid speed. It may be expensive to do at the moment, but even that may go down over time. I think it'll become a lot more ubiquitous. I think it'll be cheaper to use. I think it'll be higher quality. And I think the way in which software developers will operate, and this has been talked about a fair amount, but I believe it, is that they will be orchestrators of agents on their behalf. I think you will have 10, 20, 50, 100 agents running on your behalf to doing various things, and building various elements. You still have to be really sound in your ability to ask the right questions, make sure the tests are really well thought through. So the fundamentals of software architecture, et cetera, I think are very, very important still. But the work that you're doing, you're obviously not going to be in a terminal sort of making syntax changes. I think you're in the process of just explaining what you're trying to accomplish, and really sort of crafting almost with a team of AI agents to produce the outcome that you're trying to do, they're trying to sort of generate in a short period of time. So I think every individual becomes almost, you're forced to become a manager of agents at the end of all this. And I think that's a seed shift from becoming just an individual that's just writing code in his terminal, her terminal. Everybody now becomes a manager of digital agents.
Last question then, is that something developers are going to welcome?
Yeah, I think there's we have a very large community, about 100 million people. And when I look at them and I talk to many of them on a weekly basis, there's a big curve, much like you've got the early adopters and the laggards and so on. But people, there's a group of folks who are very, very, let's call them sort of, you call it upset or maybe a little bit melancholic about the fact that, so long are the days where you actually, wrote code and you sort of went through the process of doing it manually. And there's some amount of regret in those when you talk to those folks. But there's an entirely, obviously, the larger portion of the kind of the curve is dedicated to people who are very rapidly adopting these AI tools, who have never known, and then of course folks who have never known anything different, who are just entering the space. I just heard from somebody who has never written software, a good friend of mine, but he is now writing software left and right. I mean, he's nowhere close to having a computer science degree like myself, but he is doing, very advanced things. And so I think it's obviously lowered the barrier to entry. And so for those people, I think it's a complete blessing, right? For anybody can now write code, which is, I think, pretty amazing. So there will be a little bit of I think there'll be a spectrum of folks. I think most will welcome it, especially as the market for developers increases. So you're going to have, 10, 100x the number of developers as you had before, developers in quotes, relative to, the folks who were let's say the OGs. I think the OGs will continue to be skeptical for some period of time, but they will also embrace it over time. Because, that's the only way to go. You've got now, it's the equivalent of all of a sudden somebody handing you a calculator to do math when you never actually had one to begin with. And so that, I think, changes the game.
Yeah. All right, Prashanth, thank you so much for those insights and for joining me today on Control-Alt-Lead.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate the questions, and great seeing you again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Control-Alt-Lead, which brings us to the end of the season. We'll be taking a break through August and restarting on the 31st of August when you're all back from holiday. Until then, you can always follow computing on LinkedIn, YouTube, and WhatsApp for more great content like this, and head to computing.co.uk for more IT interviews, research, and analysis. And if you're an IT leader with an opinion or a story to tell, please do get in touch at tomallen@thechannelcompany.com. Until next time.